Welcome to CXD, the podcast from Engine, where we explore the art and science of reimagining customer experiences. Now, today I'm joined by a very special guest, Joe Macleod, designer and author of End and Endineering, which are two of the most inspirational books I think designers, marketeers, or entrepreneurs can read, and certainly one of the most inspirational ones that I've read in a long, long time. Now, I'm going to let Joe explain a little bit more about Ends, but in essence, it's about a critical part of customer experiences that are often overlooked, their endings, and why we sadly tend to ignore them, why that's bad, and what we can do about it to help make the world a better place. So Joe, we first met probably 20 years ago. Can you give me a little bit of a potted history of your journey from UX designer to pioneering engineering?
It's been a very long journey. I actually dug around in this subject matter in about 2005, and I'd done a short project for Orange, the mobile phone company, about closure experiences. Closure experiences are a little bit different to the experience of an ending. Closure is certainly about getting satisfaction out of a product experience. And so in that time, I investigated it on that level. I then went off and done my career, and I worked I worked with you for a little bit. I worked for Nokia for many years. My last big job was at a company called Us2, where we done digital product. It's like apps and stuff for people. So I was head of design there for a good few years. And then I started looking into this issue around endings, and I wanted to revisit it. I wasn't expecting much out of it, more of like a short project to do. And it just opened up as this problem space. And I found it absolutely fascinating. I really had to tell people about it. I thought I'd write a Medium article or do a conference talk, but actually I thought I have to tell this in a more a bigger way. So I thought maybe I'm going to have to write a book, and I'm really dyslexic, so that wasn't really a joyous idea to having to write a book. So I started by writing one chapter, then two, then three, and then uncovered this world that I think we miss. We totally overlook it, but we misdiagnose it as well. And we see it as a problem to be avoided. And actually what I'm trying to say in the most enormous summary is this is a place to do much better, healthier, more profound work than we have given it an opportunity to do.
So could you give us some examples of so when we say kind of the end of something, what sorts of scenarios are we talking about? How do we typically come across, or perhaps indeed don't come across them in the world we live in now?
So I mean, you can look at that through different sectors as well. So if we look at it through the service design lens, we've got enormous amount of financial services that are very excitedly sold, purchased, and then paid off over decades. And then we never celebrate that final bit of that thing. Yet, arguably for a mortgage, for example, that's probably the biggest payment you're going to be making for the rest of your life. It's the biggest burden on you financially every month. And then at the end of that, we basically give them a letter. And the amount of money that is profited off that relationship, to the point where you could easily put aside a tiny fraction of that to send people on a massive holiday after they've paid off a mortgage or done other. And we also see it in things like healthcare, where we fail to really celebrate conclusion of treatment. We see a little bit of a change in that in there's a thing called the end of treatment bell in hospitals. Yeah. It came out of children's wards, where you can celebratory bang something which is intense, it's noisy, it's celebratory, and it punctuates the experience. But the experience a lot of people have is like the disease isn't shown now, and that's very different to your treatment's ended. And so a lot of things work around vocabulary. So that's just in services. If you look in products, there's a lot of talk, as we all know, around climate, around plastics in the sea, around all sorts of aspects of overconsumption. And what we tend to do is look at these spaces entirely differently. So the onboarding of the customer experience is about individualistic, self-actualization, celebrating consumption, celebrating that individual desire, and flattering yourself. And the offboarding is riddled with guilt. Many of the experiences are unactionable, so the consumer finds it hard to really feel like they're consciously getting involved and doing the right thing. We use shame and guilt at the end of the consumer life cycle instead of very sophisticated emotional triggers at the onboarding. So we use this very old school, very brutal, self-deprecating skill, psychological sort of techniques at the end. So it goes on everywhere in different modes, really.
So that's like, so that I remember in the book you were talking about this this shame and guilt, but the way you're sort of kind of getting, like, let's say you have a I don't know, some kind of entertainment service or some broadband or whatever service, and you want to move on from it. The way they cling on to you and they try everything they possibly can, even kind of boring or frustrating you into submission to remain. Is that an example of what you mean about sort of using the wrong emotions to desperately try to keep people?
Absolutely. And so a good example of that is cable companies, instead of celebrating the relationship you've had together and allowing people to leave and potentially giving them a token to then give to someone else to start another relationship, that would be a celebratory sort of collaborative coming together at the end, and also the provision of something else to happen. But what we tend to do in a lot of businesses like this is to get a professional salesperson, for example, to give a 1 hour offboarding intense sales call, and then you get horror stories like elderly people, vulnerable people signing up for, I don't know, some sports package or movie package. And so we use the wrong techniques at the end. What we should be doing is investigating the end as a place to do much better work. And partly that problem is that we just so few businesses look at it as a place to do work.
So when I was reading your book, I was thinking back to over the years, or obviously a lot of customer experience design is about journey design, and you have those classic frameworks where you sort of set out what the journey is. It's all about awareness and acquisition and onboarding and in life and what have you. And there's so much attention put to that front end, but at the back, it's kind of like there's nothing. I felt reading the book that it's like there is a phase that's missing in a customer journey, which is about the end. And for the very obvious reasons that even just kind of commercially for a business, it's about connecting you on to the next opportunity, but in a very, very positive way. So there's a thing that's kind of good for the customer in that respect. But also there's a massive thing about simply being good for the world. In the book, you have this this lovely chapter which is called the distancing and the fading, and I think there you're sort of talking about how it is, almost like historically, how endings have become something that we have become more remote from, and maybe intentionally or without much consideration to begin with, but because we've become less involved in the endings of things, they're no longer in our consciousness, and we think someone else is dealing with it. We take no more responsibility. And that's what's creating all this clutter. Could you expand that? It was a fascinating idea, this distancing and fading.
If you go back in time to the consumer experience, pre-industrial times, consumption was very much about not only the creation of the matter, like for example the food on the kitchen table, but also about the dismantling of that matter. So the waste from that kitchen table would then go to the animals. The waste from the animals would then go to the land. The harvest and abundance from the land would come back to the kitchen table. When we talk about circularity, we talk about materiality in that, and that is we've missed a big part of what's going on in terms of experience. So when we start to look at the disengagement of the end, that fading of the experience at the end over the last 200 years, we can see how scientific it's become. So what was things which we witnessed, which we handled, which we could action at the end of the consumer life cycle have become the responsibility of scientists, the responsibility of municipal groups and governments. The language they use is very different. The engagement that we have is very different. And I think a good example of that has been climate change. And, you know, if you go back 10, maybe 20, 30 years even, the language used came from science. It's carbon tonnage, it's emissions, and it wasn't consumer language. And we do this over and over again. And I think a really good example of that is to look at the language, the engagement that we have around plastics. I've never gone to the shop and bought plastics. It's a consequence of that consumption. No one goes out to the shops and goes, I'm just popping down the shops to get the plastic. You go down the shops to get other things. But yet at the end of the consumer life cycle, we start talking about plastics in the sea like they've appeared from space. And until we start matching these things up, that sort of onboarding, offboarding, it's going to be hard to get consumers to engage in actionable behavior that means that we can see it as a consumer experience, not just a circular economy experience, which is also alienating language to the consumer.
And also that we miss massive opportunities to make it really easy to be better about things. There's a wonderful example you gave. I think you're talking about something we all do with, like, you know, printer cartridges. And you kind of order someone, and that was all great. But then realizing, okay, how do I dispose of these cartridges was, as you all know, an absolute faff. And you said something incredible, like if only they just put, like, what was it you said, like added something into the delivery that could help you return it or something. What was that about?
Yeah, so the printer ink cartridge is really toxic. Stacks of them go into landfill every year. But if you have that experience of getting a printer ink cartridge and the onboarding, the clear instructions of how to insert it into the printer, and then the printer's telling you how to get it going. All of these onboarding experiences are really clear, they're instructional, they're user-centric. The offboarding is like, hey, this contains the Neanderthal. And then there's a symbol on the back which says, don't throw it in the bin. Can you don't? I've never gone off and don't anywhere. It's not actionable, is it? And then we repeatedly give consumers at the end of product life unactionable routes out of the consumer experience. And the loss of engagement, it really falls off a cliff. So a lot of that is your brand equity as well. That engagement of falling off a cliff is brand equity as well. We've got so used to, as businesses and consumers, of not feeling like that's a place where the consumer experience should be, and therefore the brand just disappears at that end of that sort of offboarding experience.
It's like lots of brands almost like they dump their customers. Like, you know, I try to keep you, you're gone, you're dead for me, I don't care. Everything else now, you know, is your problem, kind of, go figure. What are the benefits to brands to design better endings? I mean, to brands commercially as businesses. Why should they really be doing that?
So for many levels, really. Firstly, your consumer experience. If you're passionate about the consumer life cycle, consumer engagement, consumer experience, you should be doing endings, because I can almost guarantee your business does terrible offboarding experiences right now. Your brand equity, you spend stacks of money on the onboarding, marketing, usage, branding, colours, all sorts of aspects of the consumer experience in terms of branding. Offboarding, that drops off a cliff, and so does your brand equity. That's a space to retain your brand, not to throw it away. The other thing, and it's more near term, is the amount of investment that companies are making in things like circularity, extended sort of producer responsibility. Those type of things, we as businesses are putting stacks and stacks of money into that sort of stuff. And we're not thinking about a consumer engagement around that. Yet, many consumers want to feel engaged about doing good, to offset their things, to do better, to make sure they're putting things in the right places. They want to feel engaged with that, but we're not building that consumer engagement at the end. I go to quite a few conferences around circularity and sustainability, and just baffled about the amount of talk we have around materials, chemistry, efficiencies, manufacturing, reverse logistics, and incredibly barren conversations about the consumer in that. It's like this thing's happening without consumerism. And what I find really interesting is that when I bring up and I've been told off for bringing up consumerism and the consumer experience, almost like that's what's got us here. And it will probably be the thing that gets us out of here as well. The onboarding, we spend such a lot of time doing the experience of that, and the reason humans, consumers, engage in brands is because of the experience. It doesn't matter what you make your product out of. If people are engaged in that experience and they want to engage in the product, they're going to do it regardless of what you've made it from or how good your circularity is. And so we got to use that power to create the completion of the circle at the end.
I think that's the most kind of inspiring and compelling point, that consumerism, and therefore kind of elements, consumerism never experience, is going to be the thing that gets us out of this. Because inherently we all appreciate and see what's going on in the world around us. We want to play our part, but sometimes the sort of the seeming requirement that's placed upon us, the change of our behaviour, seems incredibly massive.
Yeah, I think a good example of it is the 5 Rs, which is recycle, reuse, reduce. I can't remember the others off the top of my head.
The repair in there, surely.
Repair, yes. So it's interesting to see those things, and also interesting to see companies telling us about those. We're investing in the 5 Rs or the 6 Rs or however many Rs there are. Because if you look at those things, those activities are the result of an ultralistic individual saying to themselves, because the companies aren't involved at this period, they're asking the consumer on their own to upcycle, reuse, recycle. These are requests of an ultralistic person and driven by the benefits of society. That's not how you've been selling your stuff at the onboarding and usage phase. Those are totally different experiences. And so creating an experience that's is coherent throughout the consumer life cycle, which doesn't change the language for the consumer, but it embraces that bonding that you've created and you celebrated at the beginning of the consumer life cycle, to make sure that you then grab those assets collaboratively with the consumer, and then you complete that neutralizing of those assets, whether those be physical, digital or service assets, to make sure that completion is just, it's neutral to the environment and less damaging. And that's how you create a sort of balanced consumer experience as much as it is a circle of a material experience.
And there are really successful brands. One that comes to mind for me, it's in clothing, but it's Patagonia, who have incredible sort of me as a consumer, I think you might tell me they don't, but have incredible kind of environmental credentials, and the emphasis they kind of put into the lifelong use of their clothes, the side with the free repairs they have, the what they're made from, and they have a really massive following, a very loyal kind of customer base.
Yeah, exactly. Patagonia is a really good example of doing ending. So they're super present at the end. Not only do they talk about longevity at the beginning of the consumer life cycle, they mention the end consequentially as a lifetime experience. They are present in making you aware that you can mend your products. They encourage you and partner with you on that mending. It's not just go off and repair it. They then give you the opportunity for spaces to bring things back, get them mended, have a collaborative experience with them. And also they have the option of taking it off you entirely, and they then recycle it, and you know it's complete. So that circle, that's neat and tidy with Patagonia. There's no sort of sending it off and abandoning their customers at the end. So they're a really good example of it.
So thinking as a designer, there's a let's say there's a business. They're kind of going, oh yeah, we don't think about this, do we? We need to think more about it. How might they go about kind of beginning that journey to begin to think more about their endings and design those end experiences?
So lots of different ways. So getting the book's a good start. The Ends book is the first book, and that came out in 2017. That one really tells you the big historical, the why we don't, I think, is the why book. And the Endineering book is the how-to book. So you can get involved in that way. You can also become an engineer. So I do public trainings about 4 times a year. The next one's in September the 10th. Ebooks as well. There's ebooks of both of those. I can give you discount codes for that, and I'll give you discount codes for the course. The first thing you need to do as learning about this is change your mindset around the solution space. So much of the solution space we have for many of the issues in our landscape right now are also within the immediate landscape. So we think about technology solving a lot of things, but actually the first week of the engineering course is very much about looking back, looking at where we've got to in a sociological sense and a psychological sense to where we are today and what we need to undo in the head as much as the materials. And then you get into the second week, and we start to do all sorts of other activities, going up, looking at the more near term, looking at how transaction models impact the end and the different biases that transaction has about bringing good or bad endings. There's broadly like 5 different transaction models. We have payment before service, payment after service, scheduled payment, scheduled payment, and then continuous observation, and an immediate synchronous transaction. So if you pay before getting the service, you have no leverage as a consumer. So you can, and this actually gets characterized in many of the experiences you have. If you have a bad rail or airline flight experience, and that happens, and then you have no leverage to come back on that. So the consequences of that will be you have no leverage at the end, you have no voice at the end, and many of these businesses will just let you go as quickly as possible, or often it's fill in a form. However, if you have a business which is payment after delivery, think of restaurants. You go to a restaurant, and the restaurant, the waiter is constantly engaging with you about how's the wine, how's the meal going, can I get you anything? And what they're doing is navigating towards the end with a mind that they know exactly what's going to happen at the end. They know the consequence of the end. And at the end, if you're not happy, because there's a transaction to come, and you can overpay, you can complement them by overpayment, you can then also not do that, and then that's a big signal to your unsatisfaction at the end. So things like this really change your relationship with consumption and endings. So scheduled endings, we tend to forget about scheduled endings because they go on forever. Essentially, they are invisibly dribbling out your bank account every month. We also then we forget about that, and there's no sort of cut-off period where the negotiation happens. And without that negotiation point at the end, we fail to have resolution about quality, and I fail to be empowered. Synchronous payment is the sort of cash example thing. Go into a shop, buy a can of beans, pay some money. Actually, that's pretty good because everyone's there's conclusion on both sides there, and it happens often immediately. The biggest problematic one is continuous observation as a transaction, and that's happened in the last 20 years with things like Google Maps or any sort of business you've signed up for, which is essentially free digital. So imagine Google Maps being one of those, or even Google Search. You signed terms and conditions thing, and that clicking point of saying I agree to these terms and conditions, that was the transaction nailing down, and then thereafter they are available to go through your data, sniff around, send you adverts, targeted adverts. And with that, there's it's really far worse than the sort of scheduled payment in terms of invisibility. With scheduled payments, the invisibility comes up once a month because you see it in your transactions. With continuous observation, you've forgotten about that ever since you signed up for the thing. Cookies are a really good example of that. So I do a whole piece in presentations on cookies, but if you go onto any website, we all get those requests at the beginning of going onto a website about cookie consent. So do you consent to these cookies? And this happened initially in Europe with GDPR, but pretty much happens around the world now. Similar sort of stuff's going on. You do consent to these cookies? You say yes, and they're in the legislation around a lot of these. They have a request around when is the expiry date for cookie consent. And the trouble is that although that's there, it's not legislatively enforced, and many businesses just chuck any number in there. So on one website, as an example, I go onto this website. I look at many of the big players, their cookie consent, out of 750 cookies, I'd like to point out. If you dig into, I like to look at endings and all sorts of angles. 750 cookies on a website. I look into how long the cookie consent lasts, and it is long. So, for example, top players like Amazon and Google, they're asking for 15 years or 18 years. Then get down to ADT, I think it was. It's like 68 years. I can't approve anything for 68 years because I'm going to die before, I get to 118 or 120. So it will have to be a multiple generational cookie consent. And then you get further down into, I think Home Depot asks for 1,642 years.
You're kidding.
If you went back, seriously, if you went back in time 1,642 years, you would be at the fall of Rome. It's like asking a Roman citizen to approve something around the website. So you'd have to explain electricity, computers, and then putting shopping carts on computers. And then lastly, the company itself, which is Digital Trends website, was over 7,000 years. And the thing is that I think what happens is so few people care about this issue that they just drum in any number along the keyboard. So just lastly on this, so Google have recently been digging into sort of saying, we're not going to deal with cookies anymore. It's really bad, and somewhat around this issue as well, about cookie consent longevity. But like all big companies that are making stacks of money, and it's very comparable to the oil industry, is that they look into it and then they start to realise that this is their bread and butter. All these marketing companies giving long cookie consents and bad cookie things, they've pulled back from doing it, and only about 5% of what they promised to do this. So you've still got a lot of cookie consent issues even now.
So I was aware of cookies. I was not aware of that amount of time that you were talking about. But I got to ask the question. So in real world terms, right? Why is that kind of that longevity in cookie consent? Why is that bad in real world terms or in consumer terms? Why is that a bad thing? I mean, it's annoying and getting marketed to, but why is that bad?
It's another example of overlooking the ending. And if businesses can, by the way, the recommended amount of cookie longevity is 12 months. So these are way off the recommended. The e-privacy directive, which is the nuts and bolts of GDPR, say that it should be 12 months. So these companies are way over. But if we don't look at endings as a place to pay attention, that we end up with the sort of problems that we have elsewhere in consumerism. So I look at cookies now like I look at glass bottles and having a beer in a park and chucking it in the landfill. Glass essentially lasts like stone. It doesn't erode. It goes on and on and on. And all of the beers I chucked in landfill via a dustbin are still there. And all of the cookies that I consented to. So these are the types of behaviours that seem small, seem irrelevant, but those are the consequences that we've ended up with now, where it won't matter if I burn this extra little bit of carbon here or chuck that bottle in the landfill here.
Yeah. I think that was going back a bit. I think that where we started this, the transaction is really fascinating, and I think particularly that thing about paying before or paying after, but how little power you then have over anything to do with the ending, and we all know how much concern that gives us, because we've all had those bad experiences. But it seems that inherent in that transaction model, you have this then tension between sort of commercial drivers and then the sort of the responsibilities that consumers want to have or want you as the brand to adhere to.
And it comes back a bit to your point of service blueprints. I remember being I think we were probably both at that conference. There was a conference in Finland, and there was a company there. I won't mention them, but they were selling a service blueprint and their business and their model, and they basically just went up to usage. And I went up to them because I was already doing endings then, and I said to them, "So what happens at the end?" And they said, "Well, that's about loyalty then. Then people are loyal to..." And it's funny, but when you look back at a load of the models that we've been using in, whether it be customer experience, user experience, none of them have an ending in. And so you start looking at those things in like, my God. And the best example of this is somebody said endings. It's an amazing thing. It's hiding in plain sight, somebody said. It's the most important issue, hiding in plain sight. And it's just, we don't do endings anywhere. Like, whatever model you're using, I bet you don't have a good ending with it.
We're learning about endings. We've sort of gone through a process of, undoing our assumptions about things, etc. We're looking at transaction models. So maybe there's some realization that takes place there. Where does it kind of go from there to kind of then begin to design these endings? Is that a fairly sort of straightforward process, or are there other things that need to happen?
Let's look at two of the biggest ones, which I think really help people out, are the characteristic types of endings and the offboarding experience, as in the phases of the offboarding experience. So if you look at those two, those really help designers start digging into it. And the first one, let's look at types of endings. So you can look at, there's 8 types of endings broadly consumers experience at the end of the consumer life cycle. First one's like timeout. So that's a periodic, the end happens after an agreed period. So you go on a 2-week holiday, after 2 weeks it ends. Exhaustion and credit out is the next one. This often has a metaphor of volume. So often we use that as a monetary volume. So you've paid 10 credits for £10 of credit on your phone, and then you use that until it's exhausted. Task event completion, that often happens in services. Is a task event completion. You'll agree a service up front with someone to come amend a boiler or something. But also this is the biggest one for disposable products. Most disposable products have one job to do. They have one task to do. Hold my coffee until I've consumed it, and then you throw that coffee cup away. Broken and withdrawal, we experience this all over the place. It's a physical exertion until it breaks, or we withdraw from something because we're not happy with it, and that could be a film or a music event, or it could be something more legal where you come out of a contract. These usually end in enormous emotional disappointment, a broken withdrawal one. Lingering one, that happens at the back of your cupboards and you don't care about it. It's actually the most sort of, I think, the sort of cognitive sort of tricking yourself, where I've put that suit in the cupboard, it's been there for 10 years without being worn. Essentially it's ended its relationship, but you just haven't passed it on. So I do a whole thing about like how to move these things on. Cultural endings, these happen loads around. Fashion is incredibly nuanced. Humans are incredibly adapt to doing nuance, meaning, emotion in things, and fashion is probably the fastest one of those. So thinking about cultural endings also brings in fashion. But we also have political cultural endings, like counselling things now and stuff like that on social media. Competition endings is probably the only ending you'll be able to talk about at work, where everyone will be like, oh yes, the competition, they're going to beat us here. But the other ones you won't talk about at work much. And then the last one I do is proximity endings. So if you've moved out of the proximity of something. So, for example, I moved from the UK to Sweden. I moved out of the proximity of the NHS, for example. But you also have that in digital, where I move from Apple to Android. I move out of the proximity. And once you look at these as a way of recognising, identifying different types of endings when you're observing your consumers leaving or ending a relationship, you can then start designing with the characteristics of those in mind. So there's chapters on each one of these.
So you could choose a brand could almost recognise it typically has a particular ending. They may not be satisfied with that, or might realise that's not necessarily good for the world. Like there's a lingering ending, for example, and they could have something, that begins to shift their customers towards a different type of ending, which also aids to re-engage that customer with them in the future. So instead of that suit that's there, can bring it back, and we can, we'll turn it into something else, and there you go.
Absolutely. So being able to identify things and characterize them, that is the baseline of design. Then as you say, you can enhance those experiences of what the right ones are to do, and how not manipulate is maybe the wrong word, but using that to do the better thing, or the more enhanced thing. So the second tool I wanted to show you is the phases of the end. So if you think about the characteristics of being identifying endings, then the narrative offboarding experience is phases. So where we were talking earlier about the service blueprint charts only going up to usage and loyalty, this is the bit which is the aftermath of that. So this is like a 7-phased period that consumers go through, and I've built this up over like lots of observations over the last 10 years, and understanding what goes on through the psyche, and also there's a large amount of understanding storytelling in this. Humans love stories. We've been telling stories like millennia, long before printed press was the main way of informing people. As they, over generations, we tell stories about why this, apple tree didn't grow a certain year, and blah blah blah, sort of things like that. So it's important to humans, and we really react to stories, and we're really good at telling stories: films, books, games. Consumerism is the only sort of human-made narrative structure, because many of the onboarding and usage periods have a narrative essence. It's the only one we don't care about the end of that story. Endings in stories are super important, and we don't tell the end of the story in consumerism. We just get to this pinnacle and then leave it there. So there's 7 phases the consumer broadly goes through as they leave the consumer life cycle. The first one is this thing called the crack of doubt. And that's an emotional sort of doubt that is ebbs and flows from a lot of experiences in product, service, and digital products. Oh, that was good. Oh, that's not so good. I think I might leave and go to a competitor. And oh no, it's not so bad now, so I'm going to stay. And humans are doing that all the time. So we can stay and ebb and flow through that crack of doubt. We then get to a point where like, I'm done. I'm over this. I want to move on. So you go to acknowledged. And then that's the point where you write to the provider or stop doing it or buy another product. You start to acknowledge that this is the end, and you go into actioning that afterwards. So actioning is important because it means that the consumer's involved in it, that they feel like they're part of that solving that problem at the end. We then get to a point of observation. It's important for consumers to see things, have evidence, and this could be visual evidence, oral evidence, even emotional evidence. If you think of fireworks, they're incredibly powerful observed ending of cultural events. After observed, you get to settled. This is when the transactions and everything's been settled. I think of this in terms of airports, when you come through all of the airport experience and then you go through those sliding doors into the arrivals hall. And that's such a profound experience, I think, where you've really completed the journey, you've settled. And in those spaces, they're amazing because you can see people crying, celebrating, but they're not really celebrated architecturally. I always think that's interesting. You spend all the money up front in the departures and hall and the ticket desks, but that arrivals hall is the last thing to think of, yet I think has the cultural meaning. Anyway, after settled, there's aftermath. So you've essentially ended the relationship. You'll be emotionally raw. It could be celebratory, love that, great, or it could be I hated that, I never want, and I'm going to tell everyone not to go there. So that's a very emotional point. After a long period of time, depending on what sort of business or consumer experience it is, it can be up to 24 months in bad service endings. There's a sense of rebirth. This is a neutral cadence where consumers will be comfortable with engaging again. So you go through... So these 7 phases, maybe not all consumers' experiences will happen throughout all of them, but they're really good hooks to start building your offboarding experience into.
Yeah. I love our framework. That is brilliant. You can see how that works. And I was looking down here, so I also think back in the book, you cite this example of a kind of a couple who went through a divorce, and then at the end they very publicly acknowledged and celebrated. But you can see that not relationships, but you can see that how those things kind of apply to that. And just sort of understanding the types of endings there are, understanding the phases that we go through as designers, you can begin to kind of get into the detail of that and work that through and begin to imagine new ways of working, for sure. Joe, I think we're getting to the end now. We're getting to our own ending.
Yes,
and it's not going to be an ending. It's going to be a beginning. So it has been amazing having you talk about it. It is, it really is that the book's really opened my mind up to these things, and realizing as a person who designs experiences that literally, as you say, this is hiding in plain sight, and there are things that we should be doing to design this in. And that even through the process that we go through as designers of experiences, to even, when we're talking to our clients, begin to set this stuff out and begin that conversation within that business is absolutely critical. The book's fantastic. Endineering is a really, really practical guide to how to go about doing this, which is fantastic. So we'll put all of that in the description here. We'll put links to the books, the courses, etc., for people to explore. Can get in touch with you. We'd also like to hear back from anybody about any good thoughts, anything that Joe's talked about, and endings, your experience of endings, etc. But Joe, from me to you, thank you. It's been a spectacular conversation. I've so enjoyed it.
Thank you very much, Ollie, and it's been a delight chatting to you. Take care.